Good morning, everyone. So, in this video, you and I are going to talk about how to make a distinction, at least from my perspective, between a good programmer and a great programmer. So let's get into it. Now, I don't know if you can relate to this, but I hope you can, because it's something that I actually spoke about with one of my old colleagues just the other day. And it's something that I think, well, at least we could relate in both in our own ways, of course. And we could relate to it, basically. And hopefully you can as well. So one thing that I have found to be both a strength, but depending on the context, also a big weakness that I have. And it's something that I have to truly work on, especially now that I work in a startup, is that I get very focused. What do I mean by that? And how could that possibly be a problem? Well, it's not just about the focus, or rather maybe it's the incorrect thing to say that it's all about, or rather using the word focus might be the incorrect term. But let me just walk you through it. So one of my best friends said to me the other day that he feels inspired, or he feels he's very impressed with my ability to look at a problem, get really focused on that problem, and basically going into what I like to call a mental trance type of state, where I completely shut out everything else. It's actually to the point where, and this is probably not that common, but this is the way it works for me, everything kind of falls away. And you actually have to break my line of sight in order to get contact with me. You can virtually stand next to me, I won't notice you. And you can speak to me, I will not hear you. You have to actually break or get eye contact with me in order for me to actually react. That's how far deep in I go into what I'm working on. And for someone like him, who is very much the opposite, he has concentration problems and he's kind of impatient, that seems to be a very good thing. And although of course I thanked him for saying something that's flattering as that, I also said to him that, see, there is an issue with that as well. And that issue is that when you do that, when you go that deep into your own thought process, that might work very well. And it does work very well when you are alone, or when you know exactly what you're supposed to be doing. The problem is that that's very usually that's not the case. And that's where I have a problem. We were talking, as I said earlier, with me and my old colleague, and he said these words, which they're very true. He said that as a programmer, it's very easy for you to focus a lot on the problem at hand. But it's very difficult for a lot of programmers to take a more holistic view of what they're doing. In other words, you focus more on the code that you are writing than you're focusing on the problem that you're solving. Think about that, because there's a difference between the code and the problem. It might sound weird, and I'm not trying to get all fussy on you and give you some type of philosophical thought nut here. I'm trying to give you something that's very concrete. I have experienced so many times, and it happens all the time. That's why I find it so difficult to work in a more chaotic environment where things are not as, how do I put it? One of the biggest benefits of having a very large company, or rather working as part of a large company, is that a lot of the time there's a lot of investment into the upfront work, making sure that there are good specifications, that the development team knows exactly what they're supposed to be doing, they know the scope, etc., etc. That's not true for smaller companies and startups, where things are a little bit more loose and chaotic, and you have a little bit more freedom, but you also have more responsibility. And for some people that's great, but I argue that that's for the sort of people who have this more holistic mindset when they're doing something. And that's very tricky for some people, especially for me. If you give me the sort of a problem that you want me to solve, I will solve that problem, and I will solve it fairly well. But and the issue is that if you make things very loose and basically leave it up to me, what happens is that you're putting me in a situation where now I need to consider a more holistic viewpoint, and that's a tricky thing, because now I'm not able, or rather I can't, at least that's what I've found, I can't over focus on the problem, because I need to distance myself from going that deep into the problem, because the odds are that I have to consider more things than the thing that I'm just right now working on. How do I put this in a way that makes it more tangible to you? Well, let's talk about test-driven development. A lot of the time I see people who are religiously defending test-driven development as this great thing that you should always do. And to a point I can agree. However, an issue is that these people usually apply test-driven development rigorously to every piece of code that they write. What's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is is maybe the right way to go for a large company with a lot of money, but it becomes very costly at the same time, which means because you are in essence slowed down. And in general, at least from what I can understand, I've talked to a lot of different developers with different experience levels, and most of them fairly senior, will argue that the trick to doing effective test-driven development is to figure out which part of the code is the most critical and what parts are not so critical. What's going to change, or what has a bunch of complicated logic, and what's going to stay fairly the same. Or what's fairly simple logic that you don't have to go nuts about with tests. And figuring that out requires you to have a more holistic understanding of the system. Now think about that. You have to have a holistic view of the system. That's a very tricky thing, depending on the size of the system. If you have a really large system, it becomes very tricky for you to get that gut feeling virtually the gut feeling. To get that gut feeling, this is a good place to start doing testing, this is a bad place to do testing. And figuring that out takes experience, and it takes a holistic mindset. So when it comes to focusing very hard on a problem, or rather the software that you're writing, at least from my experience, you have to be able to take a step back and look at the problem. And that's the one thing that I truly have to work on with myself. And if you feel that what I'm saying resonates with you, I think that you should have a think about that as well. To force yourself to start thinking about the system as a whole, or rather to see more than the software or the task that you have right now. You have to be able to take that step back, look at the problem, and ask yourself, all right, how does this connect, the thing that I'm doing right now, how is this connected to everything else? What effects is what I'm doing right now going to have on the system as a whole? Because if you can't do that, odds are that you're going to find yourself in a situation very similar to where I am today, where I struggle with delivering value to my company, because the way that I work is to do the thing that I'm told to do in a very as perfectly as I can. But that's not the desired work process for this specific company. Therefore, I need to change. I need to start thinking about things in a different manner. And that can get really tricky. So hopefully you'll take this advice to heart, because, I hope that you will avoid making the same mistake as I make, because being a good programmer, well, that's kind of nice. But at least I want to be, and I hope you want as well, to, become a truly great programmer. And in order for you to be able to become a great programmer, you need to think about the problem and not focus too much on the code.